context, but I am Matt Bristow. I'm a senior archaeological investigator for Historic England. I've been working with Sarah and Neil on the High Street Has work of the wider Dunstable Priory precinct. But today I'm going to talk about the Augustinian order, of which Dunstable Priory is one of the houses, and how the rule of St Augustine was adopted in this country in the 12th century, flourished again in the 14th century, and how its particularities and in some ways peculiarities manifested themselves in the design and layout of the priories and the priory precincts themselves. So the Augustinian order, or more precisely, communities of regular canons who followed a rule attributed to St Augustine of Hippo, flourished throughout Christendom from the 11th century and in Britain from the early 12th century, following the establishment of the first Augustinian Priory of St Julian's and Botolph at Colchester between 1104 and 1106. Regular canons, or canons regular, existed by the mid-11th century and may be defined as those who lived communal organised lives defined by a rule or code in contrast to secular canons who renounced all private property. The quote, quite a famous quote from the historian C.H. Lawrence, describes them as a hybrid order of clerical monks, and that the canons lived an essentially monastic life, but actively, and this is sort of the crucial difference, actively participated in the pastoral lives of the communities around them, thus bringing the canons into direct contact with the parishioners. A brief bit of sort of history and chronology following the pontificate of Urban II, 1088 to 99. A growing number of communities of regular canons began to adopt the rule of St Augustine, and by the early 12th century the rule was adopted as universal practice by regular canons. The emergence of the Augustinian canons can be said to have been an attempt by the Church to combine the monastic life of religious communities with the apostolic work of secular clergy. That said, in England, the distinction between communities of Augustinian canons and other monastic orders was hardly distinguishable. So the rule of St Augustine is obscure, I think is the best way to say it, and the nature of the rule itself really quite vague. St Augustine was born in Tagaste, North Africa in 354 AD, and following his conversion to Christianity was ordained a priest at Hippo, where he built a monastery in which he and the community lived an apostolic life under a communal rule with all possessions held in common. Augustine and his community became well known, but by the time of his death in 430 AD, no formal rule or a code for a monastic life that he espoused had ever been written. And the closest thing that there is to a formal rule of St Augustine is a letter from 423 AD where he wrote to the nuns at Hippo. And in the precepts, he emphasizes a list of elements that could be constituted as a rule: the importance of charity, poverty, obedience, detachment from the world, the apportionment of labour, mutual duties of superiors and inferiors, fraternal charity, common prayer, fasting and abstinence, care of the sick and silence. It's likely that this booklet was adapted for use by a male community, and a masculine version was produced, which was passed down as the Regula Sancti Augustini, and other documents, each originating sometime after Augustine's death, had been known as the rule of St Augustine. So the origins of the rule and the exact nature of the monastic life it prescribed are both vague and difficult to pin down. It's, for me, sort of often brings to mind Geoffrey Rush's character describing the pirate code in the Pirates of the Caribbean, that it's less a set of rules, more guidelines, you know. And so the vagueness of the rule, the fame of St Augustine, and the perception that St Augustine's rule was closer to the life of the apostles than that of St Benedict saw the popularity of the rule spread quickly across 11th century Europe, while the vagueness also saw it adopted by other religious groups such as the secular canons of southwest England's collegiate churches. While the direct origins of the rule are unclear, the establishment of regular canons can be dated reasonably precisely to the Lateran Synod of 1059. at which Hildebrand, the future Pope Gregory VII, laid down the ideals and principles which would guide the regular canons. But it would take another 30 years or so before the first house of regular canons in England appeared in the form of the foundation of a hospital at St Gregory's, Canterbury in 1088 by the Archbishop Lanfranc, seen here on the right. The priests at St Gregory's lived a full common life and could certainly be considered to be a community of regular canons. However, it wasn't until the early years of the 12th century that the first house formally adopting the rule of St Augustine was formed in England, the Priory of St Julian and St Botolph at Colchester. The second major Augustinian priory was founded in Essex, Little Dunmow in 1106. Little Dunmow and Holy Trinity at Aldgate, founded in 1107 by Queen Matilda, was probably the house responsible for bringing national attention to the rule of St Augustine. And both can attribute their foundations to the involvement of Anselm, whose role in the introduction of Augustinian canons to England can't be understated. Following the foundation of St Julian and St Botolph's, Little Dunmow and Aldgate, the numbers of Augustinian houses rose quickly until 1120, when the number of foundations increased dramatically, with as many as 16 founded between 1131 and 1135, when the order was viewed as new and fashionable. The growth in numbers continued after the death of Henry I in 1135, and throughout the remainder of the 12th century as a steady and even more rate, before a decline in the number of foundations through the 13th century to 1270, when there were no further new foundations, until 5 new houses were founded by 1325 and 1360. We'll talk a little bit more to come about the resurgence in interest in the Augustinian rule in the 14th century. In contrast to the other religious orders, such as the Cistercians, whose constitutional documents made the foundation and establishment of new houses a well-documented procedure with precise dates of foundation and dedication, the lack of a central authority or any constitutional apparatus make it far harder to discern how the Augustinians were founded and by whom. The order also had no system of procedure whereby one house may be colonised from another, and as such there was rarely daughter houses of mother foundations that were located either in England or in Europe. This absence of a central authority and constitutional apparatus also allowed Augustinian houses to be founded for far smaller communities than was traditionally the case with the older established orders. The Cistercians, for example, forbade the foundation of convents with less than 13 monks, as did the Premonstratensians, who, while also following the rule of St Augustine, borrowed heavily from Cistercian legislation. The Benedictines too also insisted on the full convent of 13 as the normal minimum for their houses. But the Augustinians were far different. Latin Priory, for example, in Essex, one that I've worked on quite a bit, is believed to have been founded for a prior in just 2 canons. During the reign of Henry I, the majority of the houses founded, some 75% of all Augustinian foundations in this country, were founded by members of the royal court or the king's retinue, reflecting the wealth required to make the large property endowments to establish large monastic houses. The decline after 1135 of large foundations with big endowments founded from within royal circles, combined with the lack of a required minimum size for Augustinian houses, brought the foundation of a house of Augustinian canons within the reach of more modest founders and benefactors. And during the second half of that century, members of the knightly class and even the upper peasantry were able to found and patronise small Augustinian houses. I should just say with the slide, the picture on the left is St Julian and St Botolph at Colchester, and both the pictures on the right are Little Dunmow. The building at the bottom is the surviving Lady Chapel, interestingly positioned south of the presbytery. The lack of imposed minimum convent of canons for newly founded houses led to the foundation of numerous small priories clustered together. The tendency to cluster was exacerbated by the absence of restrictions governing the proximity of foundations. The Cistercian order, by contrast, decreed that their houses be at least 10 Burgundian leagues, about 30 miles, apart, in the expectation that their houses would have large communities. This wasn't the case with the Augustinians in general, and certainly not the case in Essex, where the order took root in this country. A 30-mile radius, for example, around St Botolph's, the first foundation, includes almost all of the Augustinian houses within that county. In some cases, the proximity is extreme. Latton and Waltham Abbey separated by just 6 miles, Little Dunmow and Little Lees by as little as 3, and Thoby and Blackmore by just 2.5 miles. Between the late 13th and early 15th centuries, interest amongst the gentry and nobility in the Augustinian order appears to have experienced a resurgence, to the extent that during the period the Augustinians found the mainstay of religious benefactions. Some 117 of 431 donations made to English religious houses during the period 1283 to 1407. This resulted in a small number of new foundations and a large number of rebuildings and enlargements. The vagueness and flexibility of the rule and the lack of standard routines likely appealed to patrons who sought some degree of personal involvement in the order of prayers and the manner of commemoration. Similarly, the flexibility of the Augustinian lifestyle allowed the regular canons to adapt to the desires of their patrons with regard to the nature and number of masses, taking advantage of the fact that within the community all of the canons were able to perform mass. The attraction of the gentry to Augustinian canons resulted in 7 new houses being founded between 1320 and 1378, Badlemere in Kent, Holton Price in East Yorkshire, Bisham in Berkshire, Maxstoke in Warwickshire, Flansford in Herefordshire, and Kirby Bellers in Leicestershire. The founders of these new priories and those who patronised large-scale rebuildings in addition to existing priories were characterised by a dramatic rise in status and growth of their fortunes through service to the Crown. The increase in their wealth saw the acquisition of large estates and the relocation of their family seats, and the foundation of new religious houses within their lands, or the financing of rebuilding of existing houses in the lands they'd acquired, and with the patronage that brought with it, demonstrated their status and marked their arrival as members of the local elite. What we have here is the crossing of Latton Priory in Essex. You might recognise the order of the mouldings on the piers from the pier that's the other side, that's external to that wall, that's that classic 14th century character. And I think we know from the annals that the Lady Chapel dates from that period of the early 14th century. So there's evidence here of that sort of swell in 14th century rebuilding. That is the gatehouse at Maxstoke, classic 14th century arch. That's one of the new Augustinian 14th century foundations. So more than any other order, because of their sort of role within the secular society, the Augustinians maintained closer links with the communities around them. And as a result, the sort of architectural development of their priory churches can be seen to closely follow trends in parish church architecture. Most obviously, I'm going to talk in generalities about sort of the general Augustinian plans, accepting, of course, that as a larger type of priory church, Dunstable doesn't really conform to any of them. So most obviously a single north aisle is seen as being a distinctive characteristic of the Augustinian order, possibly reflecting pre-existing parish churches close to the foundations and evolution in parish church design, and the addition of aisles to aisleless cruciform churches from the 13th century. In the vast majority of cases, the cloister and the conventual buildings of Augustinian priories sat to the south, explaining why in lots of Augustinian priory churches you don't have a south aisle, though we know, as we've seen already from the arcading here, that this was constructed originally as an aisle church, as was the priory church of St Bartholomew the Great, one of that sort of class of larger, grander Augustinian priory churches, aisled to both sides, and in this case with an ambulatory and apsidal eastern end. Let's have a look what else we've got. More generally, though, the aisleless church was the characteristic church design of the Augustinian order. But that aisleless design did require the brethren to negotiate the church stalls which traversed the crossing, and in order to access the north transept, And as a result, early Augustinian churches like St Mary in the Meadow, which is that one, often included small portiques or passages to allow access straight into the north transept without going through the nave and the crossing. By the late 12th century, new foundations were being designed with north aisles, and earlier churches were having north aisles added. And evidence in churches like St Mary in the Meadow and at Latten that these survived rebuilding show a relatively sort of old-fashioned feature. You can see at St Bartholomew as well, there's an additional access point beyond the north aisle. Likewise, the addition of chapels adjoining the presbytery east of the transepts was also common among Augustinian priories. This is Latten again, where a block doorway on the eastern wall of the north transept shows the way through into the now lost north aisle. Similarly, at Beeston Regis, you can just see it here, the other side of the transept. Another feature, not entirely exclusive to Augustinian priory sites, but reasonably numerous, is the use of wet moats to delineate the inner precinct, with surviving examples at a number of places here: Ranton in Staffordshire, Mitchelham in Sussex, Bilsington, Kent, and Olvescroft in Leicestershire. And their moats were generally cut around monastic houses for two reasons, really: either to delineate the sort of sacred inner precinct and provide security, but also to carry away water to create a dry island on which to build. The need to regularly maintain moats and to clear them of silt and dig draining channels and things makes their dating quite problematic, as they're refreshed so frequently. But in addition to offering security and part of the water management system, they're often a display of status, and I think there's further evidence through the use of moats in Augustinian precincts that close connection between the Augustinian communities and the secular world outside. And I don't think it's any surprise that all of these moats seem to date from that high period of lay seigneurial moat construction, sort of 1250 to 1350. And many of the priories that see substantial reconstructions in the 14th century are likely to see a moat constructed at the same time. It's also possible, I concede, given that the relative wealth required in order to patronise a small Augustinian house, that the land that was being endowed to the Augustinians was not the greatest, and therefore moats were required in order to drain them to build on. So a very brief romp through the style of the conventual buildings, or the cloistral arrangement. Here we have Hormond Abbey in Shropshire and Norton Priory in Cheshire, and these conform to the sort of classic Augustinian arrangement of the cloistral buildings, set to the south of the nave, around a square cloister garden, with a western cellars range, often with guest accommodation above, the eastern range springing from the southern transept, with a chapter house and the night stair taking up to the monks' dormitory above, and then leading off the dormitory, the latrines to the south. The southern range, almost always, within Augustinians, always arranged east to west, would have been the refectory, or the freighter, set into the south side of the cloister. And it would have been where the lavatorium would have been, or the cloister laver. The washing of hands before meals was characteristic of the rules followed by all monastic orders in England. And the cloister laver, complete with its fresh supply of clean, potable water, would have been an integral element to the monastic sites. In Augustinian context, we were almost always talking about this design set into the wall of the refectory, as opposed to these sort of more elaborate island laver set somewhere within the centre of the cloister. Now, this is an element that's come out of some of the research I've been doing recently on Augustinians, and isn't fully formed, but I'd like to sort of float it with you. And it's a lesser understood aspect of Augustinian priories, and it's areas within the outer precinct where annual fairs were held. So in 1203, King John granted the prior and canons not the Lord of the Manor, a charter to hold an annual fair on the 10th of May each year. Fairs were generally granted to religious houses, but in the case of the Augustinians, they often appear to relate to physical sites within the wider priory landscape. Latin, this is a map of 1666, post-dissolution. A fair was granted to the patron of the priory rather than the prior himself, likely in recognition of the completion of the priory's rebuilding, funded by the Lord of the Manor, who was the patron. It suggests that a fair granted in 1332 may have been held directly adjacent to or formed part of the priory's eastern end, and is marked as the Forbury. Okay. While the irregular shape of the field recalls the triangular appearance of numerous medieval marketplaces, the name Forbury is highly suggestive of meeting places associated with religious houses, the grandest and most convincing example of which is to the northwest of Reading Abbey, which survives today as the Forbury Gardens. Reading's Forbury was located within the outer precinct of the Abbey, but outside of the inner precinct in an area referred to as the Outer Court. Similarly to the southwest of the Benedictine Priory founded by Reading Abbey in the 12th century at Limpster in Herefordshire, Ordnance Survey maps mark an open area as the site of the Forbury. Of even greater relevance is an open area marked as the Bury by the Gatehouse at St Osyth Priory. In the Middle Ages, the Bury was likely the site of St Osyth's wool fair, although there's no documented charter to confirm this. In all of these cases, the fair site led from the outer court towards the gatehouse, or in this case, the causeway across the moat into the priory's precinct. And we've been musing about whether the site of the current churchyard, a triangular field bound by the ancient routeway across Icknield Way and the precinct boundary, could that have at one time been the site of the chartered fair granted to the priors of Dunstable? If anyone's had any references to the Forbury or Forburys in Dunstable, we'll obviously be very keen to hear them. And just to finish, here is a reconstruction of Latin Priory in the mid-14th century, showing how all of those elements coalesce together: the annual fair, the 14th century rebuild, and the moated priory, around sort of a standard Augustinian arrangement. I shall stop there. Thank you.